Hello, this is Chris Ott, and this is part 18 of this series on metaphysics. And I've been talking about perception, and I've been talking about perception as I use the term in my own work and throughout these videos and in my books and in my essays. And I've also defined consciousness and how it relates to perception as I'm using the term. Because consciousness has many uses in language, and philosophers and scientists use it in different ways, and so I've been tried to be clear what I mean, because that's sort of the MO of what's called analytic philosophy, the kind of philosophy we do in the English-speaking world today. Now, if you haven't followed these videos, this series at all, and you're just coming in, you're not going to be able to follow what I'm talking about. You have to know, have a pretty basic understanding of what I've been calling the external world, or the outer world, the unknowable outer world, or also called the material world, but material in a very specific technical sense of that which is the cause of experience, not something that you experience. Like this is a use of the word matter. This glass is material. It's glass, but that's an ancient original use of the word matter. But in contemporary philosophy, the word matter refers to something theoretical, which I've discussed. And if you haven't, like I said, if you haven't followed that, you're not going to follow what I'm saying. Now, in the beginning of this metaphysics series, I covered that in part 1, 2, and 3, and I covered that in other series that I've done, where I've covered the mind-body problem. And you can also just look up the mind-body problem. And but right now, I can't go over that again. I'm going to be talking about. I've already talked about how I deal with this mind-body problem. This problem of how our experience is not considered exactly real. Our experience is supposed to be a representation of something that's real that we don't directly perceive, because we only perceive our brain states, and that's not the material world. Those impressions that we experience in our mind or in our brain. So what's their cause? There has to be something outside of experience, and that's what they mean by the outer world. They mean outside of the realm of experience. So the cause of experience is in contemporary philosophy has been a part of an occult, unperceived, theoretical second world. That's the real world. The real world in materialism is only theoretical because you can't perceive it. My own philosophy doesn't go that way. It solves things a different way than this outer world and second world. It's not a two-world system. It's a one-world system. It takes the experiential world as the actual world, and then it posits a process of evolution of perception that produced the world we find with all its attributes. Okay, but I want to talk about how other philosophers in the 20th century tried to deal with this problem of the outer and inner world, okay? And I'm going to go over those, and I might do this over more than one video because it's a lot of material. It's very difficult. It's kind of annoying. It's a little hard to believe even, but I'm going to show where you can look all this up. I'm not making anything up. It's all in the books, contemporary books from like reputable printers. Now, before I go on, I want to review something that I've explained before in the past, but I want to review it again. Just occurred to me that it would be a good idea. And that is, I want to explain that how philosophy is broken up, because when I'm talking about these ideas, these explanations of how they account for perception and reality, and the difference. I want it to be clear what kind of philosophy I'm talking about, because I'm always using the word philosophy, and the name of the site is The Daily Philosopher, but it's not, philosophy is not that monolithic. We have to see what kind of philosophy I'm talking about. So I'm going to go over a way of breaking up philosophy so you can understand what we're talking about and what we're not. And to make this clear, and this comes from a book called The Power of Ideas, which is an introductory book on philosophy, and it starts by explaining this. So I'm going to go ahead and do this again. All right, let's see. Let's start with a kind of a pie chart. There we go. Okay. Let's say that's all the different kinds of philosophy. Well, first of all, let's divide that between the Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy. And I'm a Western philosopher, so we're not talking about this here. Sometimes I refer to some Eastern ideas, but I myself consider myself a Western philosopher, and I have studied Western philosophy, European philosophy, and American. And so that's the beginning of that. Then the next thing we divide is Western philosophy, of course, can be divided between ancient, like the Greeks and the Romans, and medieval. After Rome, we have the Middle Ages, and there's medieval philosophy, which is largely in the West. It's almost all Christian philosophy. And then we come to today, and this is contemporary philosophy. And right here, actually, I should have divided this, though. We have what's called modern philosophy, which is not contemporary. It's the philosophy of the 1600s and the 1700s. And that is called, in the West, the Enlightenment. And the philosophers were it was a very prolific period. It was an exciting period. And it's actually, even though it's a small period historically, since the beginning of philosophy back here in Greece to today, it's really the area that I focused on. And I had to later kind of fill in on medieval philosophy and ancient. I had to fill in on, because I had so focused here that I had to kind of do some catching up. And I spent a couple of years after completing my master's degree to read up. And then when I wrote my second book, because I wrote my first book pretty shortly after I graduated with a degree in philosophy, I spent 2 whole years just reading. And I was trying to read all the things that I had missed, because I was focused on what I was doing. And I read up on contemporary philosophy, and I have some of these books here. And then I felt confident to write my second book. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. So and then even of contemporary philosophy, there are 2 branches. There's what's called, let's break that up. I'll do another little circle over here. Well, we'll use the same circle, but we'll divide it. So Western contemporary philosophy can be divided in half. You have continental and you have analytic. And again, analytic, these refer to contemporary philosophy. They refer to the 20th century. They don't refer to the medieval philosophy or the Enlightenment or ancient. They only refers to the 20th and 21st century, especially the 20th century. And continental means European, mainly German and French, and it had a slant toward. It was influenced by had a different influence, and his story kind of broke away after the Enlightenment. It broke away by the influence of Immanuel Kant, and it's best known for existentialism. You've heard of? That's continental philosophy, and phenomenalism. Okay. And this has not what I emphasized in my studying. I studied analytic, and what I'm going to be talking about today is entirely analytic philosophy. And analytic philosophy is very focused on words and logic, whereas existential philosophy is more kind of poetic and inspired. And it's the existentialism, deals with like, what do we do now that there's no God? Like Nietzsche said, God is dead, and that kind of thing. Analytic philosophy doesn't think like, isn't even thinking like that. It's more trying to analyze problems using careful language and logic. And that's what I was influenced by. I actually agree with the analytic approach. I think it's fine to be, an inspired writer like Nietzsche or Hegel. That's great, but it's not what I do. So now you know. But I am different than most analytic philosophers because most analytic philosophers they share certain opinions that I don't. But the method of being very careful with language, trying not to equivocate when I talk, defining my terms carefully, and being skeptical of words that are not defined, that comes from the analytic method. And so I feel much more comfortable with it. I don't feel comfortable kind of using kind of fuzzy logic. And I'm usually trying to make things simpler, not more complicated. So it's unusual in analytic philosophy to actually have a theory. And so some people might say, well, I don't have a family resemblance with analytic philosophy because I'm different, because I do have a theory. I have a whole system. And they're also kind of opposed to systems, but I'm not. So I share some things with analytic philosophy, and some of their biases I don't share. So I'm unusual in that I think you'll be hard pressed to find another philosopher today that is gone completely out on a new theory and yet has not been condemned as a lunatic yet. I mean, you could be the first, but no one in 20 years has done that, and I've been very public with what I've talked about. And I've gone over these things with at least a dozen professors of different fields, and they've never objected. They say they've just never seen it before. So it's called the evolution of perception. But that's not what we're talking about today. We're not going to talk about my theory. We're going to talk about the alternatives, what others were trying to do from the whole 20th century. What were they doing about the mind-body problem? I've already kind of suggested what I've done, and I'm going to go into more detail about it. Although I've written it like twice, and I've done videos about it many times, but I still want to, in this series, I still want to go over it one more time here to explain it. But before I do, I love to say, well, why is there a new system? Well, I want to show you how the other attempts didn't work. Why? And this was not an easy part for me to do because I wasn't really very interested in what the 20th century was doing. I knew about it when I was studying philosophy, and I had to read it, but I didn't really focus too much on it. I found it very annoying, and there were things that caused in me cognitive dissonance and really serious headaches. Headaches so bad that I couldn't get out of bed to go to some lectures sometimes because it was so painful, because it was so clearly irrational, some of the things that they were doing. And I'm going to try to go over these today. Now, if anything causes some people some hair to get riled, then this will probably piss off some people if they are contemporary analytic philosophers. They like this stuff. I'm going to tell you what it is. People don't know. Oh, that's something I wanted to say that I find really interesting about contemporary philosophy. Prior to the 20th century, philosophy was an area that people were interested in. In the 1820s, in Europe, people would push to get in the door hear George Hegel give a lecture, because it was so trendy. They were following this stuff. He had these forms of idealism, transcendental idealism, objective idealism, and absolute idealism. People really wanted to be able to converse on these subjects, and they were subjects that were dealing with the deep problems. But today, nobody cares about philosophy. It's almost like a joke. Nobody knows anything. Nobody can name any contemporary philosophers. Very few people, and then to get somebody interested, it's almost impossible. Now, why is that? Well, I think it's going to be clear as I go on. It's going to shock some people with what's actually going on, because what's going on, there's a reason no one's interested. Okay. So I went to see two famous philosophers at a symposium, and when I was in graduate school, and there was David Chalmers was there, and Daniel Dennett was there, and a third, I can't remember who the third was, and they're very well-known philosophers in the academic world of philosophy, but there were about 20 people in that room. It's a big room in a university, like a theater. No, nobody cares. And I don't even talk about this except on these videos. I don't tell my friends any. They wouldn't know what I was talking about. Philosophy is something you kind of have to keep to yourself. And you write philosophy. You read philosophy. Today we don't, jibber-jabber about philosophy. But I think they did in past centuries. But that's something that's changed. I think part of it is the way, isn't just that people have lost interest, it's that it is less interesting. Okay, so there was a change, and that's in my book, and I've talked about it. There was a big change in philosophy right at the turn of the century, the beginning of the 20th century. In England, and so also in the whole English-speaking world, like America, the prevailing fashion was forms of idealism. Even like the transcendental idealists, that's like Emerson, they were popular in America. And in Europe, they had this thing called absolute idealism. And it was sort of stemmed down from the German philosopher Hegel, the one I said that they lined up to get in the room just to hear a lecture, because it was an exciting time. But that time ended when two philosophers at Cambridge, Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore, suddenly said, well, this is all just a crock. This is stupid. The kind of philosophy that they're having us do, we don't believe anymore. We think it doesn't make any sense. It was called idealism, and idealism was sort of the idea that everything's in the mind, and the mind is the cause of everything. And it really didn't make sense. It always ended up being what's called solipsism. And there were all kinds of problems that it created. They couldn't really make it work. Like, if everything is produced by the human mind, then there couldn't have been a world before there were people. So before there were people, there was no Earth. Well, that didn't really make any sense anthropologically and archaeologically, as you can just see immediately. So now, a book that describes this transition as these two men began a rebellion that spread across from England and spread across the English-speaking world, didn't have as much effect on European continental philosophy, which went on doing its thing, like with Sartre and stuff like that in the 60s, in the 20th century. But in like Oxford, and Cambridge and Harvard, they began to follow the path of Russell and Moore. And now this book is by Bertrand Russell, one of the most famous philosophers of the 20th century, and it's called My Philosophical Development. And this book really was very helpful for me because it explained this transition. And while Bertrand Russell wasn't all-out great guy, there's a lot of things that a lot of criticism could be made of him. This book is very sympathetic because it's written in a very candid way toward the end of his life. It's autobiographical. It's short, it's about 200 pages, and it explains that period. It explains the problems with that idealism that had been going on in the previous century, and it explains this new way that they're going to try to do. Now, one of the big things that they went back to when they transitioned to a sort of more radical kind of materialism that had ever been tried, which is where we are today, is a big emphasis on this external or outer world that I've been talking about. And he talks about it. And every book of the 20th century that talks about metaphysics will talk about that external world. I didn't make it up. You can't pick up a book and not find it. If you had a PDF of some of these books, it would help because you could just do external or outer, and you immediately find it. Outer world, external world, the outer causal object, the causally responsible outer object. It's always there. And like I said, they don't mean outside your brain. They mean outside of your experience. That's the real world. In this analytic philosophy, especially initially, they embraced that because they were wanting to get away from the idea that everything's in the mind, which I don't believe everything's in the mind, and I've said that. Definitely everything's not in your brain. So, but they were trying to get away from these problems. And so to do that, they had to emphasize this, even though it was theoretical, this outer world. And they had to focus on it as like the most important thing, even though there's nothing you can say about this theoretical, unknowable outer world that you can actually know. So it's not even clear it's philosophy. It's more kind of like dream-based or something. But I'm going to show how confused that idea was. And didn't just start in the 20th century. There were materialists before, back in the even in the Enlightenment. But I'm going to show how their thinking had a problem and they couldn't see it. And it's very funny. Actually, I'll kind of start with that. This be one of the first examples I want to give of where you see a kind of weirdness that comes from this external world problem. There was a guy named Samuel Johnson, and it was after George Berkeley had written his book where George Berkeley was an immaterialist, and he objected to this external material world. He said, it doesn't exist. The only world that there is the one we experience. This is the world. And there's laws of nature in it because there are laws that govern this experiential world, which he assumed were created by God. And so Berkeley had this theory and later became called subjective idealism, but it wasn't really a subjective idealism. It had an objective world in the mind of God. And God implanted copies of those ideas in your mind and your soul, and that's what you were experiencing. So you're really experiencing the ideas in the mind of God. Okay, so you can see how medieval, how Christian that was. And Berkeley was an Anglican bishop, actually, after he wrote his work, because he wrote his work right after going to college. He was very young. But anyway, there's been a biography of Samuel Johnson, I believe, and a guy's walking with Samuel Johnson, who's a philosopher, and then Samuel Johnson says, he says, he kicks a rock and his foot rebounds off the rock. And he said, I dispute Berkeley thusly. There's my dispute, my refutation of Berkeley. But the kooky thing is he just demonstrated that you perceive your foot hitting a rock and that it functions by natural laws, none of which Berkeley ever denied. So his thinking that Berkeley was denying the unseen external world, or the material rock and foot that you can't see, that's what Berkeley disputed. He didn't dispute that you could see or feel your foot. Experience is what Berkeley said was the world. So the guy's demonstrating the experiential world by kicking the rock. See, there's an experience. I experienced that. You experienced that. So that's ridiculous. He didn't know what he was doing. There's something about this external world that gets confused up with the experiential world. And this happened again in the 1930s, where G.E. Moore, who was with Russell, brought back this external world idea. And he was trying to prove the existence of the invisible matter. Now, why would he be trying to prove it? Because you can't perceive it, because it's outside of perception. If you're following me, these people were convinced about an occult means hidden, some world that you can't see that's somehow the cause of the experiential world. And that's the real one, the one you can't see. So G.E. Moore said, well, he couldn't come up with a verbal proof of this other world. So he said, finally got so frustrated that he said, here's the proof. I can't do it with words. I can do it by showing you the proof. See? You see? That's my right hand. And now you see? That's my left hand. This is true. This is a very famous event. So was the one with Johnson. He is demonstrating that you can perceive his hands. That would be more of a demonstration that the experiential world is the real world. But he was doing this as a proof that there was an unseen other world that's theoretical. That doesn't even make any sense. So there's a real... This is why I would get these headaches. And I couldn't even come. But even worse things. I heard worse things than this. This is just the stuff from before I ever was born. The stuff that was happening in my lifetime, and I don't know to what extent what goes on today in these universities like Stanford, University of Chicago, Harvard University. I don't know. But this is what was going on in the 20th century. And I'm going to go over this. Although after Moore and Russell did their kind of primitive arguments for this material world, because they were trying to justify it, and they realized the problems of it. The rest of philosophy after them moved toward behaviorism. And I'm going to explain behaviorism. And most of the theories of metaphysical theories of the 20th century are just sort of rewording behaviorism. So if I explain behaviorism, you sort of have the 20th century, with the one exception I'll get to, which is also a form of behaviorism, but these behaviorisms just use different methods mixed with behaviorism. Now, the idea of behaviorism, well, it began in psychology with like Pavlov's, experiments with like dogs salivating and stuff like that, and and he got all these scientific awards and stuff. And then, who was it after him? B.F. Skinner. And B.F. Skinner is like the father of radical behaviorism. And this was popular in the 1960s. And Skinner was at Harvard. And radical behaviorism was the view that when we talk about inner experience, we're really talking about external events of like movement of the body and muscles. So when you say somebody's happy, you mean the sides of their lips are turned up. That's what you mean. And when you they wanted to translate all language about inner states, like I'm happy, I'm sad, glad, mad, to what you do when you're happy, glad, sad, mad, okay? And because that's what was real, because it was on the outside. Well, on the outside of what? Well, I guess because what are my arms outside of? Well, it's not clear. But they felt that was somehow connected with the external world. But that's not the external world. The external world is outside of experience. But they thought because that that it wasn't going on in their brain, it was going on the outside of their brain, like on these appendages, fingers and face muscles and stuff, that could be observed by scientists. Like 10 scientists could stand around a guy, and then he could be, making his eyebrows go up and down. And you could all write down, how many, and you could quantify that. His eyebrows went up an inch, and they came down an inch, and he did it 10 times. And it's scientific because you have all these, it's like a repeatable experiment. Whereas if you ask the guy, what his beliefs are, well, I don't know, is that real? So more and more they wanted to dispute that there was any internal experience at all. There was only external stuff, okay? They wanted to dispute that there was consciousness in people or animals, and they wanted to dispute that there was even thinking. It only looked like they were thinking. And actually, the idea that you were conscious and having conscious thoughts in your head, that was a linguistic confusion. Your language, when you talk to yourself about thoughts, convinced you that there were thoughts, like your word consciousness made you think that you were conscious. It's kind of like a robot who's confused and thinks it's conscious, but it's not. This is absurd, because all the things that they're observing, the behaviorists, are happening in them. It's happening in them. Like they're denying neurology. They're denying that experience happens in the brain. Where is the experience happening? On my arm? It doesn't make any sense. So they're essentially denying other people's internal experience based on their own internal experience. Because realize if there were 10 people around a test case, and they're all writing notes about what he's doing, they're all having a private experience that's subjective, but they're having an intersubjective experience. They're all having roughly the same experience, but it's all had by each one individually in his brain. So what are they doing? They are totally confused, utterly confused. But it gets worse. It gets worse. Because they couldn't solve this problem, and everything that they tried, and behaviorism really wasn't solving the problem, they came up with another idea called linguistic philosophy. It was begun by the late Wittgenstein, who was voted up. He was the only philosopher that was voted one of the 100 most important men of the 20th century. And he came up with this linguistic philosophy. And he had students that were very excited, and it still goes on. And they use these methods that you wouldn't believe. Now, these methods are not methods for solving the problem of the connection between mind and body or something, or the external world. They're so frustrated and sickened by their inability to solve these problems that they found methods to force students to not think about them. This is explained in a book with an introduction by Bertrand, by the way, who began the movement of analytic philosophy. And it's called Words and Things by Ernest Gellner. And no one ever recommended this book to me. This would have stopped my headaches if I'd read this, because I would have understood what was going on. And Bertrand gives a scathing introduction talking about these methods, and said is the most lazy kind of thinking he ever heard of. Well, what did it become by the 1950s? This book is 1958 or 9, I forget. Is that it would be like this. The way you solve philosophical problems is you force people not to ask them. So how there had always been, like in the Middle Ages, the question of free will. And there are all kinds of factors that come into this. It's a big academic discussion, free will. And professional philosophers have dealt with it for hundreds and thousands of years. Is there free will? Well, the linguistic philosophers got this idea that we can learn things from how people just normally talk. So they give an example of a guy who just got married, and he's a newlywed. You're at the wedding, and he's having some drinks, and he's really happy. And then somebody says about him, which would be a natural thing to say, he married her by his own free will. Oh, well, see, we use the word free will, so now we know there is free will, because that's a natural part of speech. You see how stupidly lazy that is? Because it's sort of just a figure of speech, that's how we know. So by this, you would say, if a guy says, let's go catch a sunrise, honey, he thinks the sun moves and the earth stands still. Well, now we know that Copernicus was wrong. We learned it because there's an expression, sunrise. So that would be an extension from to show how absurd this is. It gets worse. These philosophers took it upon themselves they felt that all the problems of philosophy were just because people were asking ridiculously questions. All deep questions were just stupid. Anybody who would ask them is just an idiot. That's the problem. Now, if you could teach students, and you weren't teaching them anything, but rather you were like a therapist, like a counselor, a therapist, and you were going to help them to overcome their curiosity about anything. So, for instance, you talk, one of these professors, this is the training actually, this is all explained in here. He'll tell a student, he'll get in a conversation and the word consciousness will come up. Like, are we conscious? And the professor, who's a linguistic philosopher, he'll go, what is consciousness? And he'll say, well, it's like, when you're like, see, you can't explain it. And then he keeps doing this, and then he'll use some other words, and he'll go, well, what is that? I don't know what that is. No, he's pretending. This is called gaslighting, all right? You gaslight the person until he breaks. Because you're an authority, and everything he's saying, you're saying is ridiculous, and you get him confused, and then you see how confused you are? When you go down these avenues, you're just going to make yourself confused, so don't go down them. Don't ask those questions. So the idea was to be anti-philosophical and try and push students to become shallow and to kind of disallow any deep thinking or questioning of the universe. There you go, solved problem. Problem solved. There is no problem. Mind-body problem? What's that? Oh, a mind. What's a mind? I don't get it. You know what I mean? The student goes, no, I don't know what you mean. It's a trick. It's all it was. And then they would pretend that they were unconscious, because this dealt away the problem of consciousness and perception. And then, so it is said of behaviorists, and these people were, by the way, behaviorists. I had a professor, I won't tell his name. He was one of these philosophers, and he was a behaviorist. And he did say, what is consciousness? But then the next few days later, in one of his lectures, he's using the word consciousness over and over. He was just gaslighting me by pretending he didn't know what I meant. And then another thing he told me about the behaviorism, he says, if you take a corpse and you pull up its lips like this, it's happy, because that's what happiness is. A corpse is happy if its lips are up. That's how crazy it is. Now, and they behaviorists deny that torture should be banned because people don't really experience anything. Now, this is a lie. They're lying. They're joking, because when they go to the dentist, they ask for Novocaine or to be put unconscious so that they don't experience the root canal. They're just bullshitting. The whole thing's bullshit. Because it had to turn to bullshit because they had removed the idea of perception. because they had, remember, made a rule that it's only perception. It's not perception like if I say, well, I'll explain that in a minute. It's not perception unless you know that the cause of the experience is in that outer world that you can't perceive. How could you possibly know that? You don't even know that there is such a world. But that's what perception. Perception is only those experiences that we take through our senses of the external world. But now they're confusing external with outside of your head, because your senses, are on the outside of your head. So they don't even know what they mean by external. But let's see. Now, this is very connected to what I had talked about in the discussion of the word, the history of the word perception, and how Thomas Reid was a philosopher really at the very end of the Enlightenment, reacting to the Enlightenment, trying to nix the whole idea of perception. And so he's the one who defined perception as only those experiences that you know because of some natural magic that God made in people, that they know that their experiences are caused by things in the other world that we can't perceive, that's theoretical, that only philosophers talk about. I personally don't believe in, and I don't think anybody would if they heard enough about it. But this is what they hold on to. And so we got rid of the word perception. Remember, I talked about that. And I said at the time, this was very bad for philosophy because there is now no word for what we mean in all the senses in which we take experience of things, when we become aware of things. And they're even denying, by the way, awareness. So they literally deny perception and they deny awareness. And they want to define perception in such a way that a thermostat is perceiving, because it changes when the temperature goes up and down. So it must be perceiving the temperature. It's ridiculous. They've changed the definition to become mechanical. We'll get to that. That's called machine functionalism, which was another attempt to solve the mind-body problem by avoiding and escaping the problem and changing the meaning of natural meaning of words away from common sense, and then calling it common sense. Well, let me come back. So let's take the word perception. You would think that you could just substitute the word with something like experience. Like, since you can't use the word perception for like when you experience your dream, just say you experience your dream, okay? That way you don't use the word perception, but let's say I go on a date with a girl, and I perceive that she's nervous. Now, how can I say that without the word perceive that she's nervous? Or I see that she's nervous. How can I say that? Can I say I experience that she's nervous? No. That's kooky. That doesn't express it. He doesn't say, I experience that my date is nervous. No, that's like saying you experience her nervousness. No, I perceive from her behavior and her the things she says and so forth, that she's nervous, and the fact that she's shaking and stuff. And I'm sympathetic, and I can even imagine what it's like to be in her shoes, and I perceive that in my imagination. I perceive my imagination. All these things. I don't experience my imagination. Doesn't even make any sense. I experience what it's like to be in her shoes. No, I don't. I perceive what it is when I introspect. And they remove introspection, they remove thought, they deny that thought happens. At least conscious thought. They think that only things happening is like machine functions, like a computer or a thermostat or an ATM machine. That's what's going on. But our language has confused us into thinking that we're consciously perceiving, because we talk like that. Well, that's absurd, because you'd have to be consciously perceiving your words to be fooled by them. And even being fooled by something is like seeing something a wrong way, which is acknowledging your conscious perception. So they're contradicting themselves all over the place. So I sort of segued into talking about functionalism without giving a heading. So there's this other thing. It's the contemporary mainstream view of philosophers that really don't care about metaphysics, and it's called functionalism. If you ask a philosopher, what's your position on philosophy of mind? Well, I'm a functionalist. But they're kind of nervous when they say it because they don't want to get into it. But functionalism is what I just said. It began in the 1980s when desktop computers appeared. Professors started to play with them, and they thought, wow, this is a great analog for like what we think is thinking. Maybe we're not thinking at all. It's just computer functions. And, we're kind of like just sort of organic computers. And that's what it is. We're like robots. We're like an iRobot. But so there's all these movies of robots waking up, becoming conscious. That's all out of functionalism. But functionalism is basically just behaviorism. They're saying that what looks like conscious awake experience and emotions and inner states is really just these computer functions of the brain. And can they point to the brain doing any of these functions? No. There's a thing called token identity theory. Token identity theory is the idea that something in your brain is happening and that's causing you to have an internal state like a dream. Okay? I can't tell you where it is because I've looked, and while stuff is going on, it's not the same from person to person. So what's happening in the brain and things, we can't isolate exactly what's happening that makes the dream or how it makes the dream. So what token identity theory says is that, well, whatever is making the dream in the brain, whatever is happening in the brain that's causing the dream is the cause of the dream. Well, that's a tautology. Whatever is the cause is the cause. Well, duh. Brilliant. This is what philosophers are doing because they don't have anything. Because basically, it all began with Reid. In the Enlightenment, they were dealing with the real problem. And they were making headway, I believe, in Kant, and also in Berkeley before Kant. So in that 18th century, there was a lot going on. Hume understood this problem, Locke, Berkeley, Kant, and they were facing it. They weren't doing these ploys and this horrible, horrible, cheesy thinking. Like whatever the cause is, it's the cause. Well, we don't know what the cause is, so it's not a type identity. We can't say what kind of action causes the dream, but we can say that in every case something is, and that's the cause. It's just kicking the whole thing down the road because they can't address it. Because they have created a problem with this external world that doesn't actually make any sense. And even they're talking about external and internal, they get it mixed up with like, this is the external, and then what stuff in my brain is internal. But all experience, according to neurology, is internal in some sense. So they just all mixed up, and they can't climb out of it. Now, there is not all philosophers of the 20th century deny that there is consciousness. There's a group of philosophers called property dualists. And David Chalmers, to his credit, is a property dualist. And he believes that there are two things. There's physical things, which he's wrong when he points to things like pens and things around us, because that's not physical, that's actually mental, but he doesn't understand the mind. No, he totally does understand the mind-body problem. He's brought a lot of attention to it, I'm sorry. But anyway, he feels the way he addresses the problem of the internal and external, how does the world we can't see produce the one we do? He agrees that we are conscious, that we have conscious experience, that we really have toothaches, that we're not just robots thinking that they have toothaches, which doesn't make any sense. He says we really are. But how that happens, we don't know. But we know it's got to be something physical because they're materialists and they don't want to be what's called substance dualists like Descartes, who believed that there was like a mind substance. So they don't want to believe in a soul or anything spiritual or God. So they want everything to be material, but they want to solve their problems that way. But what they mean by material is all goofy because, remember, nothing we experience is technically speaking, material world. It's the effect of it in our brain. That's not my view, but that is the view of contemporary neuroscience. So these, so the property dualist, how does he solve the problem? He doesn't know. How could he even speculate on how something he can't see causes what he sees, right? So how does he do it? Or he thinks he can look at the brain and maybe they'll find something to how the brain does it, which doesn't make any sense because the brain is part of your subjective internal experience. When you're looking at a brain, everything you study in science is the experiential world. Nobody ever did any scientific inquiry into the unseen theoretical world. That would be impossible in principle. So anyway, in spite of all this confusion, how does somebody like Chalmers deal with the problem? Well, he says that it'll be 100 years. In 100 years, we'll know. But I heard him say this 25 years ago. And I saw an article recently, and it said, well, what are they doing? He said like 30 years ago that it would be in 100 years. And now it's 30 years later. What does he say now? He still says 100 years. Because they're just going to kick the can down the road. Because again, it's another game. It's a way to not have to deal with a problem. Just like behaviorism is, just like functionalism is, just like linguistic philosophy is, just like all of them are, and identity theory, token identity theory. The cause of whatever it is the cause. Whatever the cause is, we'll know it in 100 years. This is like, we have to avoid the problem. But we can't completely, we got to pretend like we're dealing with it. So they have all these pretend ways, including telling people they don't know what they're talking about. I don't know what you're talking about, which is an actual method. Explained in here. So, and Ernst Gellner is an important philosopher. And like I said, it has an introduction by Bertrand Russell. It's like just about the most famous philosopher of the 20th century. So, I didn't make this up. I was shocked when I learned it. I had it done to me, and my only reaction was to start feeling kind of nauseous, like what's going on? And later I realized what was going on. And I've heard other philosophers say that what they're doing today, they're kidding. They're kind of kidding. Philosophy today is a kind of joke. Just like politics, just like economics, just like so many things today have become disingenuous and basically fraud. This has happened to philosophy too, at least in Western analytic 20th century philosophy. But we're in the 21st century, and the time has come for a new revolution. And I'm trying to start it. And that is to go, wait a minute. Everything everybody's talking about is part of the experiential world, even these philosophers. When they talk about, when they're sitting there and they're thinking of the methods to avoid the problem, that's internal. But so is like the cup in front of them. It's internal, private, subjective experience. Remember part 1 of this series. You only perceive your own ideas. You can never get out of yourself to experience the world as it would be if it was not being perceived, which is what the external world is, theoretically. As Kant said, the world as it is in itself, unperceived. What's that? Well, we'll never know because it's unperceived, right? Right. Otherwise, it's not the world as it is in itself. It's a world influenced by your impressions and your chemistry and your mind. So I posit a whole other approach where we just take the perceptual world, the experiential world is the world. Forget this theoretical other world that they've been trying to stuff in down their own throats for 123 years. Forget it, 120 years, because this revolution started actually in a particular year, 1903, and now it's 2023. So it's 120 years that we've been trying to jam this idea back into philosophy, and it's not working, and it never did, and it never will. And I think I've made it clear why it never will. How can we ever know anything about a world we can't perceive? It certainly has nothing to do with science. Remember, science is empirical. All science is based on studying the experiential world. and manipulating the experiential world. So why not for explaining the experiential world, we have a theory that deals with how the experiential world itself evolved by schemas of experience, which I've explicated in 2 books and lots of videos. Anyway, that's all I have to say. I know this was probably hard to follow, and I hope I don't have to do this again. It was hard, but I knew this was going to be a tough one. If you want to know, I'll put in the show notes under this video, I'll link to this book by Bertrand Russell where he talks about these events in 1903 where he and G.E. Moore began to try to accept again this external world, outer world, as an explanation. He's very honest and upfront about it. And I'll send a link to this book by Gellner, Words and Things, which is not, the title makes you think it's about the connection between words and things. Oh, I want to say something about that in a minute before I check out. I forgot to include this. And I'll put that Gellner book, the name and author and publisher. And this book is worth reading just to throw up. This book is called Consciousness Explained by Daniel Dennett, who's just a fake. He's a phony. But what you'll learn, a guy that's pretty smart once said, he read the book and he said, it should have been called Consciousness Ignored. Because that's really what it is. He's trying to do what the others do. Trying to evade the problem. And he does it not masterfully, but he tries to be masterful and very, very dishonest. He contradicts himself all over the place. And he talks about the external world, the outer world. Everyone does. Now, this book, I'm also going to give, because this really helped me to understand, and I still forget. Like, I was wanting to read this again. Oh, but anyway, let me finish my sentence. It really helped me to understand all these analytic methods of dealing with the mind-body problem and philosophy of mind, metaphysics. And it's called The Philosophy of Mind by Smith and Jones. Isn't that funny? That sounds like their aliases, Smith and Jones. But this was an excellent, excellent book. It goes over, and it's from Cambridge University Press, so it's not just some fly-by-night self-published book. And I'd recommend that, because all these forms of philosophy are gone over, and you see the problems in them just by reading it, although they're trying to sell it. They're trying to sell it as brilliant, but none of it works. And they kind of admit it in here. So does Dennett. Dennett actually says, in this book called Consciousness Explained, he says, we may never be able to understand consciousness. So it doesn't really explain. That's part of the method, the dishonesty, bait and switch. Okay, I wanted to add one more thing. Remember I was talking about Wittgenstein, the sort of crazy, wacky German philosopher who came up with linguistic philosophy, where finally... from his writing. Okay, so Wittgenstein he was a behaviorist. He didn't believe in consciousness. He didn't believe in perceiving things. And so he wanted to be able to escape any talk about perception or conscious experience or, happy, sad, glad, or mad, or anything that goes on subjectively, which is absurd because, of course, every thought he ever had is had subjectively, but he's too dumb to notice that. But anyway, because I have explained how language is possible in terms of perception. It's so simple, it's hard to tell because it's so simple. So you look upon this. I don't know, can you see that? It's a J. So you look at that as a sign for the sound je, okay? All right. What's the connection between this squiggle and the sound je? What's the actual connection between this sign and its referent, the sound je? There is none. I assign the connection, and I perceive the connection once I've assigned it. So I see it as representing je. Doesn't really in some other world or anything, but because Wittgenstein could not talk about perception or have the word, remember, go back and rewatch the part, the history of the word perception, and you see he couldn't. They had made this stricture on themselves. He had to find some other connection between the J and the sound je and things in the world. So this actually became a serious problem for him. And it's celebrated that he dealt with such a deep problem. And he was looking for, how does language, which is signs, like the letter J, how does language hook on to the world? See, why would it have to hook onto it? Because he's materialist. Because everything has to be by the metaphors and stuff of physical stuff. So just like the water in here is hooking on to this glass somehow. See, it's moving with the glass. So how does language hook on to the world? He can't go, we see it as representing things in the world because we invented it. No, he can't say that. Because that's mental language, even the inventing. So he has to act really profound about his idiocy. It's like that Idiocracy movie. It's really funny. So many things that they struggle to explain can be explained just if they already were understood before they got rid of the word perception and made it have this crazy occult meaning, which doesn't even make any sense. This metaphysical meaning. But they loaded their metaphysical theories into the literal definition of the word. It's in the Oxford English Dictionary that that things that you perceive have as their cause things in the occult, other, hidden, external, outer world, which means outside of perception. That's actually in the dictionary because it got put in there by that guy, the Sir somebody, I forget, who's obsessed with Thomas Reid. And he was a baron, and he must have had influence over the Oxford Dictionary authors, or lexicographers, they're called. Well, I'm glad I got this behind me, because now I can go on and talk about other things. But this was bothering me because I didn't even know if I could cover this, because it's really, I thought of rereading all these books. I read them a long time ago, years ago. I thought of rereading them in preparation for this video. But I started, but I just couldn't do it. It's just too painful. So I'm going to link to them. So you can do it if you don't believe me. And thank you very much. Remember, these books that I mentioned are in the show notes. And I'll see you next time in part 19. And I look forward to it. Thank you very much. See you then. Bye.